Washington, D.C., May 2016. A journalist at Bloomberg News receives a response to a Freedom of Information Act request she filed with the U.S. National Archives. The Treasury Department, after 4 decades of silence, has agreed to release a set of diplomatic cables from 1974. What was in those cables had been an open secret in certain financial circles for years, whispered about in academic papers, referenced obliquely in memoirs, filed under the general category of things that happened but were never confirmed. Now it was confirmed. I've spent time going through both the cables and the reporting built around them, and what strikes me is not the content of the deal itself, which once you understand the context of 1974 follows a certain logic. What strikes me is the duration of the secrecy, 41 years, through 13 presidential administrations, through oil shocks, Gulf Wars, September 11th, two invasions of Iraq. A handful of Treasury and Federal Reserve officials kept one of the most consequential financial arrangements of the post-war era out of public record for longer than most of the people who negotiated it were alive. The question is not just what the deal was. The question is why it had to be that secret. To understand July 1974, you have to understand what the 3 preceding years had done to the dollar. In August 1971, Nixon had ended the dollar's convertibility into gold, the foundation of the Bretton Woods monetary system built at the end of World War II. The dollar was now fiat currency. Its value rested on confidence alone. Then in October 1973, OPEC's Arab members imposed their oil embargo. Within 3 months, crude oil prices had quadrupled, from roughly $3 per barrel to over $11. Inflation in the United States was running at more than 12% annually by mid-1974. The stock market had lost nearly half its value from its 1973 peak. The economy was contracting. The Nixon administration was simultaneously collapsing under the weight of Watergate. Nixon himself would resign on August 9, 1974, 5 weeks after the flight that is the subject of this story. The dollar had no gold backing. The economy was in a tailspin. The government was days away from its worst political crisis since the Civil War. And inside this wreckage, Treasury Secretary William Simon was handed a single assignment: find a way to make Saudi Arabia finance the American deficit. The choice of Simon tells you something about how desperate Washington was. By the summer of 1974, Simon was 47 years old, a chain-smoking bond trader from New Jersey, who had run the government securities desk at Salomon Brothers before Nixon drafted him into public service. His colleagues in Washington described him as having a temper and an ego that were, as one account put it, painfully out of step with diplomatic culture. He had compared himself approvingly to Genghis Khan. The week before his flight to Jeddah, Simon had publicly called the Shah of Iran, a critical U.S. regional ally, a nut. This was the man Nixon sent to negotiate the most sensitive financial arrangement since Bretton Woods. The conventional reading is that Simon was ill-suited for delicate diplomacy. I think the opposite is closer to the truth. Simon's entire career had been built around one specific skill: understanding what makes U.S. Treasury bonds attractive to buyers who have alternatives. He had spent decades convincing institutional investors, pension funds, foreign central banks, sovereign wealth managers that American debt was the safest place on earth to park large sums of money. He knew how to sell this idea, not with diplomatic language, with arithmetic. That's exactly what Riyadh needed to hear. The oil embargo had created a paradox. Saudi Arabia and its fellow OPEC members had, in the space of a few months, accumulated more dollar revenue than their economies could immediately absorb. Saudi Arabia's current account surplus reached extraordinary levels, at its peak in the mid-1970s, equivalent to more than 50% of GDP. The question in Riyadh was not whether to invest this money. The question was where. And here is the dynamic that Washington understood, and almost no one in the public conversation about this period ever discusses clearly. Every major Western economy was competing for Saudi investment. An economic officer at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh from 1976 to 1978 later described the situation precisely. Britain, France, Japan, the United States, all of them were working to attract Saudi petrodollars back into their own financial systems. It was not a coercive arrangement. It was a competition, and Simon's argument was the strongest one on the table. U.S. Treasury bonds offered depth, liquidity, and the security of the world's largest economy behind them. No other market, Sha'amas, not gilts, not JGBs, not French government paper, could absorb the volume of capital Riyadh needed to deploy. The deal that emerged was less a shakedown than a match. Both sides had something the other needed. What made it unusual was the terms under which it was documented. Andrews Air Force Base, July 1974, 8 a.m. A steady pre-dawn drizzle had passed. The sky was overcast. Simon and his deputy, Jerry Parsky, boarded their flight. Officially, the trip was a 2-week tour of economic diplomacy. Europe first, then the Middle East. The standard schedule, bilateral meetings, formal dinners, handshakes for the cameras. The real mission was a 4-day layover in Jeddah. Nixon's instructions, as relayed through the inner circle, were unambiguous. Parsky, who would later recall the details to Bloomberg, described the assignment in terms that left no room for interpretation. There was no coming back empty-handed. At stake was not just the immediate financing of the U.S. deficit. Washington had also calculated a second-order threat. If the Soviet Union moved into the financial relationship Saudi Arabia was about to have with someone, the Cold War balance in the Middle East would shift in ways that went beyond economics. The Americans needed the deal. The Saudis, as it turned out, also needed the deal, and they just needed it on different terms. There is a version of this story, widely circulated, particularly in conspiratorial financial commentary, that frames the petrodollar arrangement as American coercion, Washington using its military leverage to force Riyadh into a dollar-denominated oil pricing system. The actual documentation tells a more complicated story. The June 8th, 1974 agreement, and signed publicly between Nixon and King Faisal just 1 month before Simon's Jeddah mission, covered economic development and defense cooperation. It said nothing about currency. The Saudis had been selling oil in sterling as well as dollars and continued to do so after signing it. What King Faisal actually wanted, as the subsequent negotiations clarified, was something more specific: anonymity. Saudi Arabia would invest billions in U.S. Treasury bonds, but the kingdom's holdings would not be reported in the standard Treasury data that was released publicly. Every other foreign government's holdings were disclosed. Saudi Arabia would be carved out, its position hidden from the aggregated figures. The reason was domestic politics. Faisal was navigating a region where being seen as a financial pillar of American power carried real risk. Saudi Treasury holdings visible to the world would be Saudi Treasury holdings visible to every government and political movement in the Arab world that viewed Washington as an adversary. The secrecy was not Washington's demand, it was Riyadh's condition. The arrangement was finalized across several meetings through the second half of 1974. The structure, when assembled, had 3 components. The United States would purchase Saudi oil. Washington would provide military equipment and security cooperation to the kingdom. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would recycle a substantial portion of its petrodollar revenues into U.S. Treasury bonds, and those holdings would remain hidden from published Treasury data. The petrodollar system that emerged from this period was not, strictly speaking, a formal contract requiring all oil to be priced in dollars. It was something more durable, a set of aligned incentives reinforced by military relationships and financial interdependence that made dollar pricing the practical default for the global oil market. Saudi Arabia controlled swing production for OPEC. If Riyadh priced in dollars, the market priced in dollars. And if the market priced in dollars, every country on earth that imported oil, which was most of them, needed to hold dollars to buy it. This was the mechanism, not a signed document requiring dollar pricing. A web of relationships and incentives so interlocking that no single government needed to be told what currency to use. They arrived at the answer through arithmetic. The effects moved through the global financial system over the following years in ways that were, at the time, only partially understood. Saudi oil revenues, recycled into U.S. treasuries, provided Washington with a source of deficit financing that was both large and, crucially, invisible. See, by the time the Bloomberg FOIA response arrived in 2016, the accumulated Saudi position in U.S. government debt stood at $117 billion, making the kingdom one of America's largest foreign creditors. That figure represented the visible portion. The actual historical flows, given the decades of hidden reporting, were almost certainly larger. Western banks also played a critical role in the recycling mechanism. See, petrodollar deposits in London and New York were lent to developing countries, particularly in Latin America and Africa, fueling the sovereign debt expansion of the late 1970s that would eventually trigger the debt crises of the 1980s. The arrangement Simon negotiated in Jeddah did not just stabilize U.S. government financing, it seeded the next 30 years of global capital flows. This is the part where the popular version of the story requires some correction. The petrodollar narrative, as it circulates in financial commentary, and particularly in the coverage that erupted in June 2024 when Saudi Arabia chose not to renew the Joint Economic Commission, tends to present the arrangement as a formal binding treaty requiring oil to be priced exclusively in U.S. dollars. That document does not exist. UBS chief economist Paul Donovan, reviewing the June 2024 coverage, called it directly, "The June 1974 public agreement had nothing to do with currencies. The Saudis were still accepting sterling after signing it. What did exist was the secret late 1974 Treasury arrangement, confirmed by Bloomberg's FOIA request, which was about investment flows, not pricing. The petrodollar system is real. It shapes global trade to this day, but it emerged organically from a set of aligned interests, not from a single document stamped secret in a Jeddah conference room. This distinction matters, not as a technicality, but because it tells you something important about how power actually works. The most durable systems are not the ones held together by contracts. They are the ones where every participant, acting in their own interest, arrives at the same behavior without being told to. The arrangement that Simon built in 1974 created a constraint that operated in both directions. For the rest of the world, needing dollars to buy oil meant holding dollar reserves, which meant demand for dollar assets, and which meant the United States could borrow at lower rates than any comparable economy. The exorbitant privilege that Giscard d'Estaing had identified in the Bretton Woods era did not end with Bretton Woods. It found a new mechanism. But for the United States itself, the arrangement carried its own costs, ones that would compound over decades. American foreign policy in the Middle East became structurally entangled with the security of regimes that Washington would, in other contexts, have found difficult to defend publicly. The relationship with Saudi Arabia, the arms sales, the intelligence cooperation, the willingness to overlook domestic practices that sat uneasily with American stated values, all of it flowed from the logic Simon had locked into place in Jeddah. Gordon S. Brown, who served as an economic officer at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh from 1976 to 1978, described the dynamic with precision years later. Everyone, the U.S., France, Britain, Japan, was competing to get into Saudi financial flows. Washington won that competition, but winning meant accepting the terms under which the Saudis were willing to be won. The secrecy was one of those terms. The military relationship was another. The political deference that followed was a third. Nixon resigned 5 weeks after Simon's flight to Jeddah. King Faisal was assassinated in March 1975, 7 months after the deal was finalized. William Simon left government in 1977 and returned to the private sector. He died in 2000, the arrangement he built still operating, still hidden, still shaping the global financial system. What he had constructed was not a monument, it was a machine. It ran on self-interest. Saudi Arabia needed security guarantees and a place to deploy surplus capital. The United States needed deficit financing and a mechanism to anchor global dollar demand after gold. The system that emerged from those two sets of needs was reinforcing. The more it ran, the harder it became to dismantle without cost to both sides. Parsky, speaking to Bloomberg in 2016 at age 73, said the secret arrangement should have been dismantled years earlier. He was surprised it had lasted as long as it did, but he had no regrets. Doing the deal, he said, was a positive for America. He is probably right about that in the narrow sense in which he meant it. What is harder to assess is the full ledger. The arms sales, the political entanglements, the decades of foreign policy constrained by a financial arrangement that almost no one in the American public knew existed. In June 2024, Saudi Arabia chose not to renew the Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, the public 1974 agreement. Social media interpreted this as the end of the petrodollar. Searches for the term spiked to their highest level since Google began tracking the data in 2004. Financial commentators predicted dollar collapse. The dollar did not collapse. Because the petrodollar system was never held together by a document, it was held together by something that a FOIA request cannot fully illuminate. The accumulated logic of 50 years of interlocking dependencies. Saudi Arabia's current account surplus, which once exceeded 50% of GDP, had by 2024 fallen to roughly 0.5%. The kingdom was borrowing in sovereign debt markets. It was selling partial stakes in Saudi Aramco. The structural foundations of the 1974 arrangement had already shifted quietly, long before any formal expiration. What I keep returning to, reading through the cables and the retrospective accounts, is a detail about the secrecy itself. King Faisal did not ask for the arrangement to be hidden because he was ashamed of it. He asked for it to be hidden because in the political geography of 1974, that Simon built in Jeddah across 4 days in July 1974 is fraying at its edges. New alignments are forming. China and Saudi Arabia, BRICS and Gulf states, UN-denominated oil trades beginning to appear in the data. None of them have yet produced a system as self-reinforcing as the one a chain-smoking bond trader from New Jersey assembled in a coastal Saudi city. In the summer of a presidency that was already dying. The architecture of global finance still bears his fingerprints. Most people have never heard his name.